They stand at the opening of a warm interval in Earth's long Ice Age rhythm around 130,000 years ago, when forests thicken and grasslands widen across much of Africa, and rains pulse more reliably with the seasons. In this interglacial world, known to researchers as marine isotope stage 5e, the planet settles after the harsher cold of the preceding stage, and coastlines creep inward as oceans swollen by melted ice press higher against the land. Sea level stands several meters above today, a planetary baseline set not by human activity, but by the slow tilt and wobble of Earth's orbit that shifts sunlight across latitudes and strengthens monsoons. The air holds more moisture. The Congo Basin gleams with floodplains, and gallery forests thread along rivers into the savannas. Herds of grazing animals follow green corridors, and where water collects in broad pans and shallow lakes, birds rise in synchronized sheets at dawn. Early Homo sapiens live within this wetter geography. Small bands dispersed across eastern and southern Africa with stone points shaped by careful preparation of cores, an approach modern scholars call the Levallois technique. Camps cluster near dependable water and vantage ridges. Hearths are arranged and maintained. The same stones are reused and resharpened. On the southern coastline, people gather at caves that open toward the Indian Ocean, where low tides expose a living shelf of limpets and mussels, an intertidal pantry that answers to the moon. At Clayses River and nearby sites, shells accumulate with ash and bone, a lesser-known detail of the deep record showing that coastal foraging is already woven into everyday subsistence at roughly this time. Inland, the highlands carry cooler air and different plants. Here, hunters wait where antelope cross seasonal paths toward waterholes rimmed with cracked clay. Elsewhere in the north parts of the Sahara hold lakes and wetlands during humid pulses, and fish bones appear far from any modern river. A reminder that desert is not a permanent identity, but a phase in a longer climatic cycle. The people of this time move within these shifting belts, not hurried, not fixed, but adjusting to the contours of each season. The fact stands plainly in sediments and fossils. This is a warm interglacial, and with warmth comes more rain across much of Africa. Yet the quiet abundance is not uniform, and it is not guaranteed. The same orbital mechanics that favor rains also carry within them the seed of their weakening, and scientists track these swings in cores of ice shells and dust, laid down year after year, millennium after millennium. In their work, a recurring question remains unresolved. How continuous are the populations across Africa at this time, and how often do they connect? Some lines of genetic evidence suggest structured, semi-isolated groups with intermittent exchange. Other lines imply broader networks connected by marriage ties that hop between river valleys and coasts. Archaeology preserves stones and hearths better than kinship, and so the map of relationships remains partly in shadow. What is clear across the continent is a continuity of practice, gathering plants that return after rains, hunting at the margins of water-sharing work around the heat of fire, and selecting ochres that stain hands and stone with iron-rich reds and yellows. In some caves, ochre pieces show grinding and scoring. In others, heated stones and dense ash mark repeated visits to the same hearth locations. Firelight throws steady halos on walls at dusk, and tools lie in clusters where they are napped and left, then returned to and refreshed when edges dull. The planetary background remains in motion. Ice sheets in higher latitudes retreat, coral reefs grow near the sea surface, and coastlines move inland. A person walking along the Eemian shore would find the waves breaking where tens of millennia later, ground stands dry. As glaciers release water, the oceans draw a wider hem around every continent, and the boundary between savanna and desert in northern Africa slides northward with stronger summer monsoons. Across this reshaped geography, people also glance outward. In the Levant, at sites that will be occupied in the coming millennia, early modern humans appear during warm phases, hinting that windows open beyond Africa, when climate aligns pathways of water and vegetation. But in this opening chapter, the focus remains on the African heartlands, where the expectation of rain still guides movements, and where the memory of dry years carried in stories that archaeology cannot recover quietly influences choices about when to move and where to wait. A single hearth might serve for a season and be reclaimed later, its ash compressed by feet and time. A cliff shelter might hold sleeping places near its back wall to catch offshore breezes on hotter nights. People watch tides and winds, read the return of certain insects and flowers, and measure the year by rhythms learned from older hands. They do not know that beyond their horizon the sea has lifted by something on the order of 6 to 9 meters relative to our present era. They know only where the practical shore lies, where the shell beds renew, and how long to wait before the rough swell calms enough to wade safely onto the rocks. Even within this favorable climate, scarcity flickers at edges. Dry spells nibble at lake margins, and a failed rainy season can scatter bands thinly across a catchment. A planetary-scale perspective frames these local concerns. Earth's climate machinery responds to slow variations in orbital precession and tilt modulated by greenhouse gases exchanged between ocean and air, and the monsoon belts migrate like living boundaries that breathe. The same mechanics that deliver the green years also set the stage for retreat, and in this world at 130,000 years ago, the arc toward future droughts is already faintly inscribed in the geometry of the planet's path around the sun. The archaeological record keeps its quiet ledger. Broken animal bones with cut marks speak to marrow extraction. Microscopic residues on tools trace plants processed for starches. The spatial patterning of flake debris records the order of work. On a scale as simple as a day's walk, bands range between inland pans and coastal shelves. On a scale as grand as a continent, populations occupy a mosaic of ecozones stitched together by corridors of water and savanna. A person could cross a seasonal range longer than the distance between modern city pairs, separated by many hundreds of kilometers, and yet still remain within a familiar cycle of return. From the vantage of today, one more unresolved mystery shades the scene. How many people are there? Some genetic models, set against later patterns, hint at small effective population sizes. Others, calibrated with broader archaeological visibility, allow for more people than the sparse record suggests. The truth likely lies in a landscape of uneven densities, a denser coast here, a thinly peopled interior there changing with rain. For now, the rains still come. The rivers braid and unbraid within their floodplains. Wetlands ring with frogs at dusk. Flint and hornfells catch the glow of embers. The world at 130,000 years ago feels stable to those who live within it, steady enough to anchor teaching and travel, predictable enough to plan for the next shellfish harvest or antelope migration. But a long view sees the hinges that will swing the monsoon, that will falter, the lakes that will pull back from their banks until shorelines turn to salt and dust. As the section closes, the stage is set: a warm planet, higher seas, greener belts, and people adapted with quiet competence to a generous climate, carrying skills forward into the long oscillations of the Ice Age. The rains begin to weaken, not abruptly, but through subtle shifts that accumulate across centuries until entire generations live with skies that hold back, more often, than they release. Around 125,000 years ago, the same orbital patterns that once strengthened African monsoons tilt away, and with that adjustment the lifelines of rivers and lakes diminish. The great green belts that had stretched across much of Africa begin to fragment, their margins creeping inward as grasses fade to dust and shrubs give way to bare ground. Sediment cores extracted from ancient lake beds confirm this slow unraveling. Layers, once thick with pollen from wetter vegetation, thin out, replaced by dust carried from dry soils and by grains deposited in quieter water. A factual marker of this period lies in the dramatic contraction of East Africa's Great Lakes. Lake Victoria, the largest tropical lake in the world, nearly vanishes more than once, shrinking to the point where its basin lies cracked and exposed, while Lake Malawi retreats into narrow remnants tucked within its basin. The landscape loses its shimmer of water, and with it go the fish populations that once supported human and animal life in abundance. This drying trend does not strike evenly. Some catchments maintain water longer than others, and the patchwork of survival zones shifts from generation to generation. A lesser-known detail emerges from Middle Stone Age archaeological sites along now dry lake margins. The stone tools found there testify to human presence even as the water retreated, suggesting that people stayed as long as they could, adapting to the final unreliable flows before moving away. In the archaeological record, these tools often appear with thick bands of eroded sediment between them and later occupations gaps that reflect times when landscapes simply could not support human settlement. The rhythm of absence is as important as the rhythm of presence. For those living within this tightening circle of water, each dry year lengthens the journey to a reliable source. Each failed monsoon season stretches the distance between foraging grounds and the very routes once linking groups across savanna. Corridors turn into barriers. Herd animals shift their ranges in search of grass, and the hunters who follow them must decide whether to risk the expanding dry zones or withdraw toward shrinking oases. Archaeologists infer such pressures not from written testimony, but from scatterings of stone flakes, from the absence of hearths in formerly busy shelters, from the sudden decline in faunal remains that once reflected regular hunting. The disappearance of activity is itself a kind of evidence. In this uncertain world, mysteries multiply. Researchers still debate how early Homo sapiens responded to these weakening rains. Did groups fragment into smaller, more isolated bands, hugging reliable water? Or did they attempt longer seasonal circuits to keep pace with erratic resources? The evidence points both ways, and no single pattern dominates. Some caves show continuity of occupation despite climate stress, while others fall silent for millennia. The unresolved picture reminds us that climate does not dictate one outcome, but sets boundaries within which human choice and luck unfold. Planetary scale patterns remind us of the forces at work. As the orbit of Earth shifts, summer insolation in the northern hemisphere weakens, and with it, the African monsoon system retracts southward. Glaciers at higher latitudes expand incrementally, storing water in ice rather than releasing it to the oceans. Global sea levels begin to fall from their Eemian high stand, exposing continental shelves, even as inland Africa suffers under diminishing rainfall. Across the continents, the same planetary gears that move glaciers and seas recalibrate the rainfall systems on which humanity depends. This global choreography brings deserts into being as much as it lifts lakes. For the small groups of humans who live through these centuries, the scale of planetary motion is invisible, felt only in the cracking of soils and the long dry months when rains fail to arrive. A scale reference helps to measure the stress in East Africa. Lake Victoria covers more than 68,000 square kilometers in full, when it contracts to near nothing. The equivalent of an inland sea is erased, an absence larger than many modern nations. To live through such contraction is to see whole ecosystems vanish within the memory of elders, to inherit landscapes fundamentally less forgiving. Still, the human response is not immediate exodus. Coastal refuges continue to offer resilience as intertidal resources follow lunar cycles rather than monsoons. Inland narrow belts along rivers like the Nile or Zambezi sustain pockets of settlement. The Nile itself shrinks during dry phases, but its headwaters and seasonal floods keep some flow alive, and these corridors serve as vital arteries even as surrounding savannas bleach into desert. Archaeological finds of obsidian tools, traded over long distances during this period, suggest that humans maintained exchange networks across expanding barriers, proof that survival included not just subsistence but social connections spanning regions. The drought transforms not only the land, but also the rhythm of movement. Paths that were once regular turn into precarious gambles. Journeys between waterholes lengthen beyond safety in some years, forcing bands to break apart or shift allegiance. The fossil and archaeological record preserve only glimpses of this reorganization, but genetic evidence hints that some groups became sharply reduced in size, bottlenecked into refugees that preserved only fragments of the wider human population. A critical unresolved mystery is how far numbers fell. Some models suggest humanity dwindled to as few as several thousand breeding individuals during the harshest phases of drought, a contraction that would have left a permanent signature in genetic diversity. Others argue for larger, more dispersed populations, buffered by ecological refugia. The truth may lie in both the global species shrank to precarious numbers, yet local resilience in coastlines, river valleys, and caves kept continuity alive. Across the planet, conditions shift in concert. Ice expands north seas, retreat deserts spread, and forests contract. From a planetary vantage, the world at 125,000 years ago enters a drier, harsher rhythm that will dominate the next tens of millennia. From the ground, humans register these shifts in the weight of daily foraging, in the frequency of failed hunts, in the empty shells of lakes that once shimmered with waterbirds. In the slow cadence of drought, landscapes record their silence. Dunes pile, where rivers once braided desiccated soils, crust over old fish beds, and in caves abandoned for lack of water. Soot blackens ceilings left untouched until wetter times return. The weakening of the rains is not a single event, but the beginning of a long descent into aridity. Each generation inherits a world narrower than the one before, until survival rests on scattered lifelines, estuaries, tidal flats, and persistent springs where the continuity of Homo sapiens hangs in delicate balance against the weight of planetary climate. As the rains weaken further, people retreat toward the last dependable rivers, lakes, and springs. These lifelines pull scattered groups into narrower zones, places where water collects long enough to anchor life through the lean seasons. In East Africa, the Rift Valley still holds some permanent waters, even as many basins dry to salt flats, and along these contracting lakeshores people cluster. At Lake Malawi's reduced margins, ancient shorelines mark the rapid retreat of water, yet stone artifacts show that humans stayed until the edges turned inhospitable. At Lake Turkana, sediments preserve cycles of expansion and contraction, and the archaeological record there aligns with phases of scarcity, with dense occupation evidence only when the waters briefly returned. Such settings teach the lesson that early humans moved not just in search of food, but in search of water itself. In the absence of rivers, survival narrows to the few wetlands that remain shaded by reeds, or to hidden springs at the base of escarpments where groundwater still seeps upward. Archaeologists today uncover hearths and tools at these last refuges, their presence a testament to endurance in places where life gathered under the pressure of encroaching desert. One lesser-known detail comes from the study of freshwater mollusk shells found in these contexts. Their presence indicates repeated harvesting of aquatic resources even as terrestrial prey dwindled. These small remains, overlooked against the grander backdrop of stone tools and animal bones, remind us how every resource mattered in a failing landscape. But life at the water's edge came with its own risks, as crowding increased competition for limited game and edible plants, forcing groups either to share uneasily or to disperse farther than before. The mysteries of this time are preserved partly in what is absent. Some once inhabited regions go quiet for thousands of years, leaving gaps in the record. Did people abandon them entirely, or did they persist in numbers too small to leave enduring traces? Scholars still debate whether certain stretches of the interior became fully depopulated during the peak of drought, or whether invisible bands survived in niches too fragile to register archaeologically. The question of continuity versus abandonment remains unresolved, and it complicates the story of how humanity endured. From a planetary perspective, this is not only an African crisis. As Earth tips deeper into glacial cycles, global sea levels begin to drop, and air circulation patterns alter, rainfall across many latitudes. The Indian Ocean's monsoon system contracts southward, pushing rains away from East Africa, while in Eurasia steppe belts shift and deserts expand. Dust storms become more frequent, carrying sediments into the Atlantic and leaving layers preserved in marine cores. These layers are signals of a drier world, one that echoes across continents. Humanity, still confined to Africa at this point, feels the weight of these global rhythms at the scale of every drink of water, every plant dug from hardened soil, every shell cracked at low tide. At the scale of distance, the adjustments are vast. Bands that once roamed seasonal ranges of dozens of kilometers now find their circuits constrained, and sometimes the trek between reliable waters stretches longer than a day's walk. A migration from one spring to the next might extend farther than the distance between two modern cities separated by several hundred kilometers, yet it offered no guarantee of return. These are journeys made not with certainty but with necessity. Archaeological traces sometimes capture these movements indirectly. Identical styles of stone points appear far apart, hinting at knowledge shared across regions even as populations became more fragmented. In some cases, obsidian tools reveal long-distance transport from source quarries, suggesting that trade or movement persisted even through difficult years. In caves that overlook the last wetlands, soot-darkened ceilings and repeated hearths demonstrate that people returned again and again despite the shrinking resources. They sat at fires where reeds rustled in the wind and animals came cautiously to drink, places where survival hinged on intimate knowledge of seasonal timing. The importance of memory and teaching at such times cannot be overstated, though it leaves little direct trace. Knowing which pool held water longest, which root still bore starch after the rains failed, which stone source remained exposed when others were buried in sand. These were forms of knowledge that kept groups alive through generational drought. The archaeological record preserves the tools, not the teaching, leaving us with evidence of continuity, but not the voices that carried it. A critical unresolved question remains. How small did these riverside groups become, and did they remain in contact with one another? Genetic data suggests that effective population sizes contracted sharply, possibly to only a few thousand breeding individuals across all of Africa. If correct, this would mean that entire generations lived under conditions where a single severe failure of rainfall could have erased much of humanity. Yet the very fact that we inherit their legacy proves they found ways to adapt, whether through dispersal cooperation or simple endurance. The planetary stage keeps turning. As ice continues to accumulate in the north, the sea recedes, exposing new land, but offering little relief to those hemmed in by desert. Africa's great rivers like the Nile maintain partial flow, their courses shrinking to braided trickles in places but still functioning as arteries along which survival is possible. These rivers act not only as lifelines but as potential corridors for future dispersal, though at this time they are more refuge than highway. From the view of orbit and climate, these changes unfold predictably. From the view of a human group camped on a dwindling lakeshore, they appear as unpredictable scarcity, demanding flexibility at every turn. One can imagine the silence of a dried basin once filled with bird calls and hippo bellows, now windswept and crusted with salt. Archaeology cannot capture sound, but it records silence through absence, through the void between occupation layers that speaks of landscapes abandoned. At the edges of these voids, at the last waters, humanity lingers. They drink, they forage, they nap stone, and they wait. The retreat to the last rivers is both a physical and symbolic narrowing of human space, a compression of possibility that would shape genetic legacies for millennia. By clinging to these shrinking refuges, our species preserved the thin thread that later generations would weave into expansion once rains returned. The endurance of these communities, fragile, scattered yet persistent, stands as a testament not only to adaptation but to the tenuous scale of survival against planetary drought. The Sahara, which once spread with lakes, rivers, and green corridors, now contracts into a widening expanse of dust and stone. During the earlier interglacial satellite reconstructions and fossil evidence show that the desert had bloomed into a mosaic of wetlands, grasslands, and even sizable lakes that supported hippos, crocodiles, and human communities along their shores. By 120,000 years ago, that green world collapses under the weight of failing monsoons. What remains is an arid frontier stretching across thousands of kilometers, a barrier so vast that its shifting dunes silence migration routes between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. The transition is not sudden, but steady, etched into geological records as pollen from grasses disappears and dust layers accumulate in marine cores taken from the Atlantic off West Africa. Dust grains blown from the desert floor mark each dry season, a planetary-scale signal of climate change preserved far beyond the Sahara itself. For people living near its margins, the shift means not only the loss of fertile basins, but the disappearance of animals and plants that anchored subsistence. The fossilized bones of aquatic creatures in now dry basins, tilapia catfish, even crocodile remains, are silent witnesses of ecosystems erased. One lesser-known detail lies in the scattered sites where stone tools dated to this period sit stranded in desert contexts far from any modern water. They testify to occupations that once thrived along river channels that no longer exist, and their very isolation today is proof of the desert's relentless advance. The people who once moved through those corridors now find themselves pressed back into refuges where water persists, leaving the Central Sahara depopulated for millennia. The mystery that lingers concerns how abrupt the final abandonment was. Did the last families leave as the last pools evaporated, or did pockets of humans persist in caves and wadis longer than the wider record suggests? Archaeology leaves hints, but no resolution. Rock shelters in the Central Sahara contain layers with evidence of human use during wetter times, but in the succeeding dry phases the shelters fall silent, their stratigraphy broken by long intervals of sterile sand. Yet the absence of evidence does not confirm the totality of absence. It only underscores how fragile survival becomes at the edge of habitable land. From a planetary perspective, the desertification of the Sahara reflects orbital rhythms that shift insolation and weaken monsoons. Earth's slow wobble, known as precession, alters the seasonal distribution of sunlight, reducing the strength of summer heating in the northern hemisphere. With less heating, monsoonal rains retreat south, and the Sahara transforms from grassland into desert. The same astronomical cycle that once painted the Sahara green now restores its aridity. This back-and-forth pattern repeats throughout prehistory, a pendulum swing written into the geological record. But for humans living through it, at this moment the desert is not a cycle, but a fact, a wall of sand and heat that bars movement and isolates populations. The scale of change is immense. The Sahara covers over 9 million square kilometers, an area the size of the United States, and to see it transform within a few thousand years is to witness a continent's geography redefined. For the groups living south of this growing desert, survival means adjusting to the loss of northern pathways and turning toward the remaining lifelines of coasts, rivers, and caves. In East Africa, populations huddle along rift lakes. In southern Africa, coastal caves near the Indian Ocean gain new importance. Archaeological excavations at sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave reveal repeated use of marine resources during these dry phases, evidence that some groups shifted their reliance away from dwindling inland ecosystems to the predictable rhythm of tides. The beads made from Nassarius shells at Blombos, carefully perforated and stained with ochre, are a subtle reminder that even during crisis, symbolic practices endure. They are not just ornaments, but markers of continuity, traces of shared identity that persist when landscapes collapse. The unresolved question is why symbolism intensifies during hardship. Was the making of beads and use of ochre a response to social stress, a way to strengthen bonds within small pressured groups? Or do we see only what survives by chance? Archaeologists still debate whether symbolic expression was a widespread response to drought or a local tradition amplified by preservation. What remains certain is that even in diminished numbers, people still invested time in marking meaning onto their world. From the planetary vantage, the desert that now dominates northern Africa reshapes global systems. Dust blown from its surface fertilizes distant oceans, carrying iron that nourishes marine life thousands of kilometers away. The Sahara does not end its influence at its own borders. Its desiccation becomes part of Earth's broader cycles, a reminder that local hardship participates in planetary exchange. For humans trapped beneath this dry expanse, however, it is not a global engine, but an existential wall. Migration into Eurasia, which during wetter phases had been possible through the Sinai and Levant, becomes blocked by desert corridors cutting off northern expansion for thousands of years. Populations south of the Sahara contract their genetic legacies concentrated into smaller refuges. Genetic models suggest that it is during this time that the effective population size of Homo sapiens may have shrunk to a bottleneck, potentially as few as several thousand individuals. Whether that contraction happened all at once or in scattered fragments remains unresolved, but the timing aligns with the great drought that transforms the Sahara from passage into barrier. The retreat of humanity to coastlines and river valleys underscores how fragile survival became. Small groups harvested shellfish at low tide, dug roots from thin soils, and gathered around hearths in caves that looked out over the ocean. Inland, those who remained along rivers fished shrinking pools and followed animals to the last grasses. The human presence contracts in geography and in number, yet endures. The silence across the Sahara is not the silence of extinction, but of absence, a vast void where people once walked. Archaeology records this void as sterile sand between occupation layers, a testimony not to failure, but to survival elsewhere. To live during the turning of the Sahara into dust is to stand on the edge of erasure, yet to continue narrowly along the remaining lifelines. The desert grows, the rivers shrink, but the species persists, held together by memory, by resourcefulness, and by the fragile continuity of a few thousand souls carried forward through the hardest dry years. As the Sahara settles into its long arid phase, populations across Africa grow fewer and more scattered, and the greatest concentration of survivors finds their way toward the edges of the continent, where the sea provides a steadier rhythm of food. Along the coasts of southern and eastern Africa, humans discover a refuge that depends not on the uncertain return of rain, but on the tides. Shellfish, crabs, and fish remain accessible even in the driest years, and the intertidal zone becomes a crucial pantry for bands who might otherwise face starvation inland. Archaeological sites along the southern Cape, such as Clay's River and Pinnacle Point, preserve deep layers of shell middens, piles of discarded mollusks that show repeated harvests across thousands of years. Here, amid drought that reduces lakes to dust, people bend to gather limpets, mussels, and abalone at low tide, filling baskets with food that renews itself with each cycle of the moon. This record is one of the most direct pieces of evidence for coastal reliance during the harshest phases of the Great Drought. It reveals that our species survived by looking seaward when the land failed. A lesser-known detail from these sites shows how fires built at cave mouths, roasted shellfish and fish, and microscopic residues suggest the processing of starchy plants alongside marine foods, a diversified strategy that balanced what little inland vegetation could be gathered with the constant supply of the ocean. These communities left behind not only food remains, but stone points and scrapers shaped from local raw materials, evidence that hunting of terrestrial game still supplemented their diets when possible. Yet the contrast between coastal abundance and inland scarcity sharpened over time, forcing more groups toward the sea. The mystery that lingers concerns whether this reliance on coasts was a last resort or an intentional long-term adaptation. Archaeologists debate whether inland groups migrated seasonally to the shore or whether stable, semi-permanent coastal populations formed. The record at Pinnacle Point suggests repeated and intensive use, but whether people lived year-round in these caves or came seasonally remains unresolved. What is clear is that marine resources provided a safety net strong enough to anchor humanity through the worst phases of aridity. On a planetary scale, the significance of this survival strategy reaches beyond Africa. Around this time, global sea levels begin to fall as ice accumulates in the northern hemisphere, exposing coastal shelves and expanding the available foraging zone. At low sea levels, broad tidal flats stretched outward, creating vast areas of rocky shore and estuary that magnified the marine food supply. The very process that dried Africa's interior glaciation and reduced monsoons expanded the coastlines and gave humans a lifeline. This paradox, where planetary scale change simultaneously threatened and sustained humanity, underscores how survival often hinged on chance alignments of climate and geography. The scale of movement between refugees is striking. Some groups may have traveled distances greater than 200 kilometers to reach coastal caves, journeys far longer than their earlier seasonal rounds. The persistence of occupation at certain sites shows that once these refuges were discovered, they became focal points for survival places passed down through generations as anchors against uncertainty. Along the southern coast, caves provided shelter from winds and a vantage over tidal shelves, while fresh water trickled from limestone or collected in rock basins. Firelight at night glowed against walls, and ochre fragments suggest symbolic practices continued alongside subsistence routines. The genetic record reinforces the picture of contraction. Models of human ancestry suggest that effective population sizes plummeted during this period, perhaps to as few as a few thousand breeding individuals, a bottleneck that compressed genetic diversity. If true, the people clustered in these coastal refuges carried forward the lineages that later expanded across the world. It means that our species' survival may have hinged on those who learned to live between cave and tide pool, sustaining themselves at the margin where land and sea meet. Yet uncertainty persists. Some scholars argue that inland refuges may also have supported small populations, perhaps in wetter pockets of southern or eastern Africa, where rivers continued to flow. If true, then the coastal story is only one thread of a wider fabric. Archaeology reveals most clearly what is preserved in caves. The open-air sites of inland survivors may have been erased by erosion or hidden beneath later sediments. The mystery of who survived and where remains partly unresolved. From the vantage of planetary climate, this moment is one of contrast. Ice sheets in Eurasia thicken, deserts in Africa spread, and yet sea levels drop to reveal new feeding grounds for those with the knowledge to exploit them. The same climate forces that drive scarcity inland create abundance at the shore. It is a reminder that survival is not only about endurance, but about perception, recognizing where opportunity lies as the world shifts. To live through this phase is to live with the rhythm of tides dictating meals, to move along beaches collecting food, as predictable as the phases of the moon. Archaeological layers of shells, bones, and stone tools measure this rhythm compressed into middens, meters thick, the deep time equivalent of calendars, recording countless cycles of gathering and return. These middens are the testimony that while inland Africa grew silent, the coasts remained alive with human presence. In scale and implication, the concentration of humanity at the edges of the continent is profound. What had once been a species scattered widely across savannas and river valleys was now pressed into narrow strips, perhaps no more than a few bands per 100 kilometers of coast. Yet it was enough. The bottleneck through which humanity passed did not close completely. In the glow of coastal fires, in the scraping of stone points, in the simple act of roasting shellfish and dividing the meal, the line of our species continued, The reliance on coasts preserved in shell and ash would prove one of the most critical strategies in human prehistory, ensuring that the drought that nearly erased humanity became instead a chapter of near loss rather than final extinction. The human presence along the African coasts is not only visible in shell middens and cave hearths, but also written into the invisible archive of DNA. Modern genetic studies reveal that all living people today descend from populations that endured this narrowing of numbers, a contraction so severe that it left a permanent signature in the human genome. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA, inherited through maternal lines and whole genome sequencing, indicate that between about 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, effective population sizes may have shrunk to a few thousand breeding individuals. This genetic bottleneck does not necessarily mean only a few thousand people survived. In total effective population is a technical measure, not a census, but it does point to a long period when humanity was reduced to a fragile thread. The fact itself stands. Modern humans carry far less genetic variation than would be expected if large, stable populations had persisted throughout the Middle Pleistocene. The drought years compressed our diversity, and the echo of that compression still shapes health, immunity, and adaptation today. A lesser-known detail emerges when comparing African populations with non-African ones. Genetic diversity is consistently greater among Africans, a signal that the bottleneck was most severe in groups that later left Africa. Those who remained on the continent retained more of the ancestral variation, while immigrant groups carried only a subset of it. This pattern suggests that the coastal refuges of southern Africa may not have been the only survival zones. Eastern Africa and possibly parts of Central Africa may also have harbored small but continuous populations. The distribution of genetic lineages today hints at multiple refugia, though the archaeological evidence is uneven. The unresolved mystery is the scale and distribution of these refuges. Was there one primary coastal homeland where humanity clung to existence, or were there several scattered strongholds across the continent, each contributing to the gene pool that eventually rebounded? Archaeologists and geneticists alike grapple with this question, but the record remains fragmentary. New discoveries shift the debate regularly. A handful of teeth in a cave, a layer of ochre-stained tools, a cluster of genomes from living populations sampled in remote regions. Each piece adds a shard of clarity but does not complete the picture. From a planetary perspective, the bottleneck coincides with a world entering a colder phase of the Ice Age cycle. As glaciers grow and the North Sea levels fall by dozens of meters, exposing continental shelves that extend coastlines far beyond their present bounds. What appear now as narrow beaches were once vast expanses of rocky flats, tidal pools, and estuaries, potentially teeming with marine life. Humanity's contraction to a few thousand effective individuals thus occurs within a planet where coastlines expand, deserts dominate interiors, and rainfall belts shift unpredictably. The world is not uniformly hostile. It is restructured with pockets of abundance set amid vast regions of scarcity. The human experience of this restructuring is one of confinement. Inland corridors close as deserts expand. Northward passages through the Sahara and Sinai are barred by sand and lack of water. To the south, rainforests hold resources but present their own challenges for hunting and foraging. The coast becomes both refuge and prison, a strip where survival is possible but where expansion is curtailed. Yet within these narrow margins, symbolic life continues. In caves dated to this period, archaeologists find pieces of ochre engraved with abstract designs, perforated shells strung as beads, and stone tools shaped with refined techniques. These traces reveal that even under severe demographic stress, humans invested in meaning and social bonds reinforced by shared symbols and in the transmission of complex technologies. The very survival of culture during the bottleneck may have been as critical as survival of genes, ensuring that knowledge systems carried through generations remained intact enough to support recovery once climates improved. A scale reference underscores the fragility of this moment. If humanity numbered only in the low thousands, it would have been fewer than the population of a modern small town scattered across a continent larger than any other inhabited region today. Imagine a species spread thinly enough that entire regions lay empty of human presence for centuries at a time. Yet from these few thousand, the billions of the present descend. That continuity is astonishing in its improbability, and it emphasizes how closely extinction and survival brushed against each other during the drought. One unresolved debate persists. Was the bottleneck caused solely by climate-driven drought, or did other pressures contribute? Some scholars suggest that volcanic events, such as the later Toba eruption around 74,000 years ago, may have compounded stress, though evidence of its demographic impact is mixed. Others point to diseases or ecological competition. The consensus, however, places climate, specifically the long aridification of Africa, during this interval at the center of the bottleneck. What remains mysterious is how different refugees connected. Genetic signals show that gene flow between groups continued intermittently, implying that despite deserts and barriers, humans managed to exchange mates and knowledge across distances. Perhaps rare wet years opened temporary corridors. Perhaps maritime foraging along extended coastlines linked groups otherwise separated. The mechanics are unclear, but the outcome is visible. Humanity did not splinter irreparably into isolated populations. Enough contact persisted to maintain a single, though highly reduced, species-wide lineage. From the planetary vantage, this reduction of humanity to a bottleneck is a minor detail in Earth's climate history. Just one among many shifts driven by orbital cycles, glaciation, and atmospheric feedbacks. Yet, from the human vantage, it is the pivotal threshold that determines continuity. The drought years demonstrate that survival depends on recognizing and exploiting refuges, on maintaining networks, even when landscapes fracture, and on preserving culture as carefully as food. Genetic evidence tells us that the thread held, though thinly. Every living person today carries within them the imprint of that endurance, the inheritance of a population that might have vanished. It is not a story of triumph, but of narrow persistence, of continuity in the face of contraction. When we examine shells strung as beads, or read the deep sequences of genomes we are encountering, not only artifacts and data, but the faint echoes of lives lived at the edge of extinction. Those echoes remind us that the Great Drought did not erase humanity entirely, though it came close. What endured were small bands of people bound to caves, rivers, and coasts, who passed through the bottleneck and carried forward the possibility of all who came after. Along the southern edge of Africa, a more enduring refuge takes shape, one that archaeologists now recognize as a cradle of survival during the hardest years of drought. Here, where the Indian Ocean presses against rugged limestone cliffs, caves open toward the sea and provide shelter for humans who persist when the interior withers. Sites such as Blombos Cave, Pinnacle Point, and Classes River preserve evidence of communities who relied on a mixed diet of marine resources, shellfish, fish, and occasional terrestrial game. The archaeological record shows repeated use of these caves over tens of thousands of years, indicating that people returned generation after generation to the same refuges. The rhythm of tides, rather than rains, became the foundation of subsistence. At low tide, bands moved across exposed rocky shelves, gathering mussels and limpets, prying abalone from their shells and collecting sea snails. Fires, kindled at cave mouths, roasted these catches, while stone scrapers processed plant roots and tubers dug from nearby slopes. The shells discarded over millennia formed middens, meters deep, silent layers that now testify to a strategy that carried humanity through scarcity. A lesser-known detail from these sites lies in the controlled use of fire for processing not only food, but also stone. Archaeologists at Pinnacle Point have found evidence that siltcrete, a local stone, was deliberately heated to improve its flaking qualities. This innovation, dating to roughly 100,000 years ago, shows that even in survival conditions, humans experimented with technology-refining methods that required foresight, patience, and transmission of knowledge. The heating of stone to change its properties marks one of the earliest known examples of pyrotechnology, a sign of complex cognition that persisted even during population bottlenecks. Such practices highlight that survival was never only about endurance. It was also about innovation under constraint. Yet, mysteries remain about how isolated these southern refugees truly were. Genetic models suggest small, semi-connected groups, but archaeology cannot yet show whether contact with inland populations persisted through these dry phases. Did the people in coastal caves form a largely separate refuge, or did intermittent wet years allow exchange with groups farther inland? The answer is unresolved, and it underscores the fragility of our knowledge about how humans navigated these climatic bottlenecks. From the planetary perspective, southern Africa offered a unique alignment of geography and climate. The Agulhas Current brought relatively stable marine conditions, and fluctuating sea levels periodically exposed a broad continental shelf now submerged. This Paleo-Agulhas plain may have stretched tens of kilometers seaward, offering a mosaic of grasslands, estuaries, and lagoons that supported grazing animals alongside marine life. To humans living then, this plain would have been a rich extension of the land, a space where terrestrial hunting could be combined with coastal gathering. Today, it lies beneath the ocean, but geological cores confirm its existence. The plain would have acted as a refuge, an ecological buffer against drought, sustaining both animals and people during dry phases. On a scale of movement, these southern refuges anchored populations to specific localities, creating long-term continuity that contrasts with the abandonment of inland lakes and rivers. Caves became not only shelters but also repositories of memory. Repeated occupations left layered hearths, stone, tool debris, ochre fragments, and shell beads. At Blombos Cave, engraved ochre pieces with cross-hatched patterns dating to around 75,000 years ago represent some of the earliest known symbolic markings. Though they postdate the harshest droughts, their presence indicates that cultural traditions rooted in these refuges endured and developed. It is remarkable that such symbolic practices were maintained when human numbers were at their most fragile. The unresolved question is why symbolism flourished here. Was it a response to social pressure, a way to reinforce group cohesion when survival required cooperation? Or is it merely the accident of preservation with other symbolic practices elsewhere lost to erosion? Archaeology cannot answer fully, but the persistence of symbols during crisis hints at their deep importance in human life. From a planetary vantage, these refuges were minuscule, mere pockets of persistence within a vast continent dominated by desert and drought. Yet their significance is enormous, for from such pockets the later global expansion of Homo sapiens would eventually unfold. If effective population sizes indeed fell to a few thousand, then the people who gathered shellfish on these shores may have represented a substantial portion of all surviving humans. In scale terms, humanity during this bottleneck may have numbered less than the passengers of a few modern ships spread thinly across coasts and caves. That such a small remnant carried forward the entirety of our species underscores how narrow the margin of survival became. The human experience in these southern refuges was shaped by the interplay of scarcity and abundance. Inland, the drought erased familiar landscapes, silenced rivers, and emptied lakes. Along the coast, the ocean offered predictable harvests renewed by tides. This duality defined the options available: move inland and risk collapse, or remain by the sea and endure. Archaeological deposits show that people chose the latter, in significant numbers clustering in places where marine resources could be relied upon even when everything inland failed. These refuges became crucibles of survival, where not only food, but also knowledge, culture, and technology persisted. Yet mysteries still shadow these sites. Archaeologists continue to debate whether the occupation was continuous or intermittent, whether people lived year-round in caves or moved seasonally, and whether populations were truly isolated or maintained contact with distant groups. Genetic data suggest intermittent contact, but the specifics remain unresolved. What is clear is that southern Africa's coastlines sheltered some of the most resilient human populations of the late Pleistocene. From the planetary view, these refuges align with broader patterns of glaciation, sea level change, and shifting rainfall belts. Ice sheets expand, monsoons retract, and deserts spread, but at the continental margins the sea provides continuity. Humanity contracts to these margins, waiting for climate to shift once more. The record of their survival is layered in ash, stone, ochre, and shell, the quiet archives of lives lived at the edge of extinction. In these caves and on these tidal flats, humanity persists, reduced in number but not extinguished, enduring through the rhythm of waves and the firelight of nights that stretched across millennia. The archaeological traces left in caves and along coasts during the drought years raise profound questions about the very nature of survival. Scattered across layers of ash, ochre, and shell, the evidence shows continuity of practice and persistence of culture. Yet it does not reveal exactly how small groups maintained knowledge systems across generations when populations were so severely reduced. The mystery is how symbolic traditions, tool-making skills, and ecological knowledge endured without being extinguished by the thinness of human numbers. When humanity contracted to a fraction of its former size, the risk of losing cultural complexity was immense. Yet beads, engraved ochre, and advanced stone technologies appear in the record, demonstrating that some practices not only survived, but flourished. This paradox, fragility of population alongside resilience of culture, remains one of the most intriguing puzzles in human prehistory. Archaeologists infer that social networks must have played a crucial role. Even if groups were small, intermittent contact between them could have allowed exchange of knowledge and marriage ties, preventing cultural stagnation. A lesser-known detail supporting this idea comes from obsidian artifacts found hundreds of kilometers from their geological sources. Their presence indicates that long-distance movement or exchange continued even when drought fragmented the landscape. This movement, whether by direct travel or by passing objects through successive groups, suggests that humans maintained networks of connection that extended far beyond individual caves or coasts. It is possible that such exchanges carried not only tools but also ideas, stories, and symbolic practices, weaving together a fragile but persistent web of culture. The unresolved mystery is how reliable these networks were. Did people rely on regular seasonal gatherings to exchange knowledge, or were contacts sporadic and unpredictable, dependent on rare climatic windows? The archaeological record cannot yet provide certainty, leaving us with possibilities rather than conclusions. From a planetary perspective, the maintenance of human culture during the drought is remarkable, because across the globe ecosystems contract and reorganize under glacial pressures. Ice sheets expand in the north, deserts widen in the tropics, and sea levels fall by tens of meters. Within this planetary restructuring, most species adapt in silence or vanish. But humans demonstrate continuity of symbolic life. The survival of symbolism at such a fragile demographic scale sets our species apart, showing that even when food and water dominated daily concerns, meaning and identity remained essential. On the scale of lived experience, survival during this phase meant careful attention to the environment. People learned to track the smallest signals of water, the persistence of a particular reed that indicated underground seepage, the presence of insects that swarmed only near fresh pools, the salt crust that warned of evaporation, too far advanced to drink. This knowledge had to be memorized and transmitted across generations. If a spring failed or a tidal flat changed, the consequences could be fatal. Yet the archaeological record shows that people returned to the same caves and coastlines, repeatedly demonstrating that the knowledge of when and where resources could be found was carefully preserved. The scale of contraction was immense. Populations once dispersed across vast savannas and river systems were now compressed into narrow refuges, often separated by hundreds of kilometers of desert or dry steppe. A group in one coastal cave might be effectively isolated from another by distances equivalent to modern nations, and yet they shared tool traditions and symbolic practices that suggest some measure of contact. Genetic evidence supports this, showing that while diversity contracted, it did not collapse entirely. Enough contact persisted to maintain a single species-wide lineage rather than fragmenting into isolated populations. Another unresolved question arises: why did some practices flourish in these refuges while others disappeared? For example, engraved ochres and beads appear in certain caves, while elsewhere in Africa, evidence of symbolism is absent for long intervals. This uneven distribution could reflect preservation bias, but it may also indicate that symbolic traditions were fragile, surviving only in certain refuges where population density and social networks were strong enough to sustain them. If so much of human symbolic history may have been lost in regions that failed to preserve continuity, on a planetary scale, the persistence of symbolism during the drought coincides with other species extinctions. Megafauna, adapted to wetter climates, vanish from certain regions, and ecosystems reorganize into simpler forms. Humanity, however, carries forward not only its biological lineage, but its cultural lineage, demonstrating that survival involved more than subsistence. Culture itself became a survival strategy, a way to reinforce group cohesion, transmit knowledge, and ensure continuity across generations. A scale comparison brings the precariousness into focus. Imagine a species reduced to fewer individuals than would fit inside a single large stadium scattered across a continent, yet still maintaining exchange networks and symbolic life. This level of fragility combined with continuity underscores how narrowly humanity avoided extinction. The very survival of engraved ochre and shell beads in the archaeological record is astonishing when one considers how easily they might have been lost to time, fire, or neglect. Their preservation allows us to see that, even at the edge of erasure, humans insisted on marking their world with symbols. The coastal caves of southern Africa are the best known, but evidence also comes from eastern regions where obsidian and chert tools point to innovation under pressure. Heat treatment of stone, first recognized at Pinnacle Point, required not only technical skill, but also patience and planning traits that imply a shared understanding of cause and effect. Such practices reveal that culture did not merely survive by inertia, it actively evolved in refugees where small groups concentrated. This resilience of knowledge remains a mystery. How did groups of perhaps only a few dozen individuals maintain complex traditions without them fading into simplicity? Perhaps the very stress of survival encouraged cooperation and knowledge sharing, making culture indispensable. Or perhaps we see only the lucky survivors, the few groups whose traditions endured while others vanished without trace. The planetary cycles continued indifferent to these struggles. Earth's orbit shifted, monsoons, faltered seas, fell glaciers advanced. In the silence of deserts and the emptiness of dried lakes, humanity might have seemed destined for disappearance. Yet in the flicker of cave fires, in the rhythmic return to tide pools, in the deliberate heating of stone, continuity persisted. What endures in the archaeological and genetic record is not only evidence of survival, but also evidence of resilience of culture held intact against overwhelming odds. Humanity at this time is small, scattered, and fragile, but it is not broken. From these narrow refuges, the line of our species continues carrying knowledge, symbols, and genes that will eventually expand outward again when climates shift. The Great Drought nearly erased humanity, but in its shadows, the mystery of resilience took shape, how a few thousand people kept alive the spark of culture and carried it forward through millennia of scarcity. While humans cling to coastlines and rivers in Africa, the world beyond also contracts under shifting climates. The late Pleistocene is an age of oscillations with ice sheets growing and retreating in the northern hemisphere, and each advance redistributes rainfall and temperature across continents. In Eurasia, steppe grasslands expand southward, forests thin, and deserts widen. The cooling climate draws down ocean levels as water is locked into glacial ice, exposing continental shelves but tightening the belts of rainfall on which many ecosystems depend. For humans who have not yet spread widely outside Africa, these planetary changes remain distant in direct effect, yet their influence is felt in the closing of migration corridors. The Sinai and Levant, which during wetter times serve as green gateways between Africa and Eurasia, now wither under arid conditions. Archaeological records from sites such as Kafse and Skul, which show early Homo sapiens occupation over 100,000 years ago, fall silent during drier phases, suggesting that populations attempting to expand northward were cut off by deserts. The ebb and flow of these occupations align closely with climatic shifts recorded in cave speleothems and marine cores, reinforcing the view that human expansion beyond Africa was not a single event, but a series of attempts, each constrained or permitted by the pulse of rainfall. A lesser-known detail emerges from Arabia, where paleolakes once dotted the landscape during humid intervals. Fossilized footprints of humans and animals in now dry basins, such as those in northern Saudi Arabia, testify to periods when the peninsula was green and habitable. But during the Great Drought, these lakes disappear, and the Arabian Peninsula becomes as impassable as the Sahara. These fossilized traces, stranded in desert, remind us that corridors of migration opened and closed repeatedly, often leaving no permanent populations behind. The unresolved mystery is how many times early humans attempted to move beyond Africa during these windows. Genetic evidence suggests that the successful dispersal that populated Eurasia and beyond occurred around 70,000 years ago. But earlier attempts may have left faint traces that did not survive in later gene pools. Did small populations settle temporarily in the Levant, only to vanish when climate shifted? Were there ephemeral expansions into Arabia or beyond, erased by desertification and replaced by later waves? Archaeology offers hints, but no definitive answers, and the question of how often humanity reached outward before retreating remains unresolved. From a planetary perspective, the drought in Africa is not isolated, but part of a synchronized global reorganization. Glaciers advance across northern latitudes, reflecting more sunlight and cooling the planet further, while monsoon systems weaken, shifting the belts of rainfall southward. Dust storms rise more frequently, depositing layers across oceans and distant continents. These shifts reshape habitats everywhere. Mammoths graze in widening Eurasian steppes, while in the tropics rainforests contract and savannas expand. Humanity reduced to refugees is caught within this planetary machinery, its survival a local expression of global rhythms. The scale of environmental change is immense. Sea levels drop by dozens of meters, exposing continental shelves that extend coastlines outward by hundreds of kilometers. What are now submerged seabeds become grazing plains and tidal flats, though these landscapes are temporary, destined to be drowned again when ice retreats. For humans who may have ventured across these exposed lands, the change is both opportunity and trap fertile ground, in one millennium desert or submerged coast in the next. Archaeological traces of such use are largely lost to the sea, making it difficult to reconstruct how people exploited these expanded shelves. On the scale of lived experience, however, the contraction of habitable zones defines daily life. In Africa, communities turn inward bound to caves, springs, and estuaries. In Eurasia and Arabia, corridors close, leaving fossilized footprints and abandoned sites as mute testimony to failed expansions. The global contraction leaves humanity in a holding pattern confined to Africa for tens of millennia, its outward movements blocked by planetary drought. A striking detail lies in the fossil record of animals. Hippos, crocodiles, and fish bones found in once lush Saharan basins date to wetter times, but their disappearance parallels human retreat. The animals, too, contract into refuges, and their absence from the fossil record during dry phases underscores the scale of ecological collapse. This is not only a human story, but a broader reorganization of life with many species extinguished regionally, if not globally. For humans, the absence of these animals means the loss of important food sources, further tightening survival margins. The unresolved mystery of this era is whether small groups manage to cross deserts and persist in marginal zones, leaving no trace in modern genomes. Some scholars suggest that lineages may have spread into Western Asia and later gone extinct or been absorbed. If true, then humanity's prehistory included not just one bottleneck, but multiple dispersals and extinctions. The genetic silence does not rule them out. It only shows that if they existed, they did not contribute to surviving lineages. From the planetary vantage, the rhythm of contraction and expansion is part of Earth's orbital cycles. Precession, tilt, and eccentricity align to shift insulation, altering rainfall belts and glacial boundaries. Humanity's survival depends not on changing these rhythms, but on adjusting within them, finding refuges where continuity is possible. This dependence underscores how deeply the fate of our species was tied to forces beyond its control. A scale reference emphasizes the precariousness. Africa, during the drought, may have supported no more people than the population of a single modern metropolis scattered thinly across coastlines and rivers. Meanwhile, vast regions of Eurasia and Arabia lay empty of humans for millennia, their fossils and tools marking only fleeting presences. Yet despite this contraction, continuity endured. The contraction of the world beyond Africa is thus not only an absence, but a preparation. When rains return thousands of years later, corridors will open again, and humanity will expand into Eurasia with lasting effect. But in this interval, the drought ensures that the world beyond Africa is a silent stage awaiting the return of players nearly erased by climate. Humanity's story narrows to a few refuges, but the planetary machinery continues: glaciers, advancing deserts, widening seas, falling ecosystems reorganizing. The Great Drought is a global event, not a local crisis, and humanity survives within its margins, fragile yet unbroken, awaiting the return of rain. In the midst of contraction, one constant endures: firelight in the caves. Across the sites that preserve evidence of human survival during the long drought, traces of hearths appear again and again, the blackened stones and layers of ash recording repeated returns to the same places. Fire is not only a source of heat or a tool for cooking, it becomes a symbol of continuity, a focal point for daily life when everything outside grows uncertain. Archaeologists studying caves such as Classy's River Pinnacle Point and Blombos find hearths built in similar places within the shelters over thousands of years, suggesting that the memory of where to place fire was carried through generations. Ash layers accumulate like geological clocks, each one a season or a year, when people gathered in the same spot. The presence of fire across such long intervals demonstrates that even as populations dwindled, the practice of tending and maintaining flames never ceased. A lesser-known detail comes from microscopic studies of sediments in these hearths. Researchers have identified charred remains of grasses and woods that indicate selective gathering of fuel. This suggests that humans were not simply burning whatever was available, but were choosing materials for different purposes. Some woods for longer-lasting coals, some grasses for quick ignition. Even in survival conditions, people retained a refined knowledge of firecraft. Evidence of fire use also extends beyond cooking and heating. At Pinnacle Point, the deliberate heating of silcrete stone to improve its flaking qualities represents one of the earliest known uses of fire as a technological tool. This practice required careful control of temperature, since overheating could ruin the stone. The ability to harness fire in this way reveals foresight and experimentation qualities that show cultural depth even during the bottleneck years. Fire, then, was not only central to daily survival but to innovation, a force through which humans reshaped their environment and materials. The unresolved mystery is how knowledge of fire persisted through generations when groups were so small. Did every band maintain its own fire, or was fire sometimes borrowed from neighboring groups during contact? The archaeological record cannot resolve whether fire was ever truly rediscovered or whether its maintenance was continuous, but the absence of long gaps in evidence suggests remarkable consistency. From a planetary perspective, the glow of these fires is insignificant against the vast backdrop of glacial cycles, orbital changes, and monsoon failures. Yet in human terms, each hearth represents continuity, the persistence of habit in a world otherwise fragmented. The scale of fire use can be imagined through the cumulative deposits middens filled with shells roasted over flames, layers of ash meters thick in caves, and burned bones, showing repeated cooking. Each fire, no larger than a few square meters, anchors the species against the immensity of climate. Symbolic practices also appear beside these hearths. Ochre fragments ground to powder engraved with cross-hatched lines are found in association with fire debris. Whether used for body painting, artifact coloring, or symbolic expression, ochre demonstrates that humans continued to mark meaning into their world even when survival was precarious. Shell beads strung and stained with ochre show that adornment and identity persisted, perhaps reinforced by the social space created around the hearth. Firelight at night would have illuminated these ornaments, casting flickering reflections that may have reinforced their significance. The fact remains, humans maintained symbolic life at the very moment their biological survival was most at risk. A scale comparison underscores the endurance of this practice. In caves such as clichés, river ash deposits accumulate over tens of thousands of years, suggesting that generation after generation sat in the same places, lit the same spots, and passed on the knowledge of fuel, flame, and hearth. To imagine this is to imagine not continuity of individuals, but continuity of practice, the survival of culture itself. The planetary context of these fires is one of contraction. Glaciers advance, deserts expand, and rainfall diminishes. But in caves at the continent's margins, people kindle flames that link them to ancestors and descendants alike. Each hearth is insignificant in scale compared to the Sahara or the Indian Ocean, yet without them, the line of our species would have broken. Another unresolved mystery concerns the role of fire in social organization. Was it merely practical, or did it also serve to gather people in structured ways? Archaeologists can only infer from the clustering of artifacts around hearths that these spaces were centers of activity, places where food was shared, tools repaired, and stories told. The evidence does not capture voices, but the repeated association of symbolic artifacts with hearths implies that fire was more than subsistence. It was a cultural anchor. On the scale of daily life, fire shaped rhythms. Days ended not in darkness, but in the glow of coals. Meals were prepared with predictability, and nights in caves were warmed against the chill of shifting climates. The skill of maintaining embers, carrying coals from one place to another, and rekindling flames at dawn became as critical as hunting or gathering. Without fire, survival in caves would have been harsher, diets poorer, and culture weaker. From the planetary vantage, these fires are invisible to satellites of deep time, but to archaeology, they are everything, the recurring signature of humanity in sediment, the marker of continuity through drought. The endurance of fire use demonstrates that even in near extinction, Humans did not live as scattered animals clinging to life. They lived as cultural beings who maintained habits, shared knowledge, and expressed meaning. Fire is the clearest thread binding this continuity. The drought years left deserts, empty basins, and abandoned valleys. But in caves where fires burned, people endured. Each layer of ash is a reminder that survival was not passive, but active, the deliberate maintenance of a relationship with flame that carried through millennia. As long as firelight glowed in caves along the African coasts and rivers, the possibility of recovery remained. The Great Drought nearly erased humanity, but it did not extinguish its fires. As the drought deepens and deserts spread, opportunities for movement across the continent become rare. Yet climate is not a steady force, but a shifting pattern, and within long arcs of aridity come brief intervals of moisture that open narrow corridors through otherwise impassable lands. These short-lived windows of connectivity allowed some human groups to venture into regions that were usually barren, linking refuges that would otherwise remain isolated. Geological and archaeological evidence suggests that pulses of rainfall briefly revived parts of East Africa, Arabia, and even sections of the Sahara, filling ephemeral lakes and reviving rivers that became lifelines for people and animals alike. The presence of stone tools along ancient riverbeds, now dry, marks these rare passages, showing that humans took advantage of every climatic reprieve. A lesser-known detail lies in the detection of ancient shorelines preserved far from modern water sources. In the Sahara, for example, the outlines of fossilized lakes reveal that at certain times basins stretched for hundreds of kilometers, creating green corridors teeming with fish and grazing animals. Along these margins, humans left traces of occupation, flakes points, and hearths that indicate they moved quickly to exploit resources when they appeared. These corridors did not remain open for long. Sometimes just centuries or millennia separated habitable phases from total abandonment. The unresolved mystery is whether such openings provided routes for population exchange or were merely temporary havens. Did groups truly pass through deserts to connect distant refuges, or did they live only locally until conditions closed again? Archaeologists debate the extent of these migrations, and while genetic data suggests some level of connectivity persisted, the precise routes remain hidden beneath shifting sands and lost shorelines. From a planetary perspective, these climatic oscillations are driven by Earth's orbital mechanics. Precession alters the timing of seasons. Eccentricity changes the shape of Earth's orbit, and axial tilt adjusts the distribution of sunlight. Together, these factors create cycles of stronger and weaker monsoons, which in turn determine whether deserts bloom with life or retreat into sand. What for humans was the sudden return of rain was on the planetary scale the predictable outcome of celestial rhythms unfolding over tens of thousands of years. Yet for those living at the time, such windows were opportunities for movement, exchange, and survival. On the scale of distance, these corridors could span hundreds of kilometers. A river flowing again across the Horn of Africa might connect coastal refuges with inland valleys, while a revived lake in Arabia could sustain herds and attract human groups that had been separated for generations. Archaeological surveys in these regions often find scatters of tools suggesting brief but significant occupation, implying that people did not simply endure in isolation, but seized chances to move and reconnect. The importance of these passages lies not only in resources, but in the transmission of knowledge and genes. Contact between groups would have reinforced tool traditions, allowed exchange of symbolic practices, and prevented total genetic isolation. Even rare encounters could sustain the fragile continuity of humanity. Yet the archaeological record also makes clear that these corridors were ephemeral. When monsoons weakened again, lakes dried, rivers vanished, and deserts returned. Occupations ended abruptly, leaving only scattered artifacts as evidence that people had once passed through. A striking example comes from Arabia, where fossilized human and animal footprints, preserved in ancient lakebeds, show that people walked across landscapes now utterly desolate. Their presence testifies to transient opportunities, but the absence of continuous settlement indicates that the openings were too brief to sustain permanent populations. The unresolved mystery is how far humans traveled during these wet intervals. Did some reach as far as the Levant, or even further into Eurasia, only to be cut off when aridity returned? Genetic evidence hints at unsuccessful expansions that left no descendants, suggesting that multiple dispersals may have occurred and then vanished into extinction. These lost journeys remain one of prehistory's unanswered questions. From the planetary vantage, the opening and closing of corridors reshaped not only human survival, but ecosystems across continents. Animals followed the same pathways as people: antelope, elephants, and giraffes, migrating along green belts that appeared between deserts. When the corridors closed, animals retreated or perished, leaving fossil deposits that mirror human absences. The synchrony of movement across species shows how deeply life on Earth is tied to climate cycles. For humans, corridors were fragile and rare, yet they mattered enormously. Without them, populations would have remained entirely cut off, risking cultural and genetic collapse. With them, even briefly, survival was reinforced by exchange. A scale comparison emphasizes the precariousness. The Sahara, at its driest, stretched across more than 9 million square kilometers. Yet within it, a single revived river could create a ribbon of life a few kilometers wide, sufficient to sustain humans for a few centuries. The contrast between immensity and fragility is stark. Humanity's endurance depended not on dominating the vast desert, but on following its brief openings. Archaeology captures this endurance in subtle ways. Stone points found along the shores of vanished lakes suggest organized hunting of animals drawn to water. The size and shape of hearths indicate groups gathering, cooking, and dispersing again. These traces are faint but consistent, marking the rhythm of people moving with climate's oscillations. The Great Drought was not an unbroken silence, but a landscape punctuated by these moments of connection. From a planetary perspective, such corridors were temporary alignments of orbital mechanics. But for humanity, they were lifelines. They allowed genes to flow, knowledge to circulate, and hope of survival to persist. The corridors closed as swiftly as they opened, but their legacy remains in the continuity of our species, carried forward through bottlenecks that might otherwise have severed the line. The Great Drought nearly erased humanity. Yet even within deserts, brief openings sustained the fragile links that kept the species whole. The scale of absence in the archaeological record during the worst years of drought is striking. Whole regions that once supported people fall silent for tens of millennia, leaving no hearths, no middens, no stone tools beyond those stranded in sediments of wetter times. To stand before these gaps is to confront the possibility that humanity came perilously close to vanishing. Fossil evidence is sparse across large parts of Africa during this interval, and archaeologists are left with questions that remain unresolved. Were people truly absent from these regions, or did they persist in numbers too small to leave durable traces? The gaps themselves become part of the story, as silence in the record may reflect silence in the land. A factual marker underscores this fragility. Genetic studies consistently reveal that modern humans carry a reduced diversity compared to what would be expected if populations had remained large throughout the Middle Pleistocene. The bottleneck signal suggests that only a fraction of earlier variation survived, compressed through a narrow demographic filter. This contraction may reflect effective population sizes of just a few thousand breeding individuals, a figure so small that extinction loomed as a real possibility. Yet the persistence of engraved ochres, shell beads, and refined stone technologies during this time demonstrates that culture survived, even when population nearly collapsed. A lesser-known detail emerges from paleo-environmental cores drilled in Africa's lakes and oceans. Dust levels rise dramatically during these centuries, recording the intensification of aridity and the spread of desert. These records serve as independent confirmation that the drought was global in scale, not local, and that the silence in the archaeological record corresponds with genuine ecological crisis. At Lake Malawi, sediment cores reveal that the lake nearly dried completely, its volume reduced by over 95%. Such contractions would have erased entire ecosystems, leaving only remnant refuges. To imagine human survival around these remnants is to imagine communities pressed into ever narrower ecological niches, bound to the last trickles of fresh water. The unresolved mystery concerns how small populations avoided collapse under these conditions. Did knowledge-sharing networks remain intact despite distance, or did isolation risk the loss of key technologies and practices? Archaeology offers fragments but no clarity. In some sites, symbolic artifacts appear to flourish, while in others, even stone tools vanish for long stretches. It may be that only certain refugees maintained continuity, while others blinked out entirely. The planetary perspective situates this crisis within the advance of glacial cycles. As ice sheets in the north expanded, sea levels fell by tens of meters, reshaping coasts and exposing continental shelves. Yet inland Africa bore the heaviest burden, with deserts advancing and rainfall belts retracting. Humanity was caught in a global system indifferent to its survival. The very mechanics of Earth's orbit dictated the contraction of habitats, and humans had no power to alter these forces. Survival meant only adaptation, clinging to the margins until conditions improved. The scale of contraction can be compared to the span of continents. Imagine a population reduced to the size of a small modern town, spread across Africa with thousands of kilometers of uninhabitable desert lying between them. The possibility of extinction under such conditions was profound. And yet the species endured, suggesting resilience beyond what numbers alone would imply. Archaeology records this endurance most vividly in caves along the southern coast, where middens preserve thousands of years of shell gathering and hearth building. These deposits show continuity when much of the continent fell silent. They demonstrate that survival was possible through reliable resources not tied to rainfall but to tidal rhythms. From these narrow margins, the genetic legacy of humanity carried forward. Still, mysteries linger. Did inland refuges persist in parallel hidden from the record? Were there green corridors that allowed scattered populations to reconnect at intervals, preventing complete isolation? The evidence is incomplete, and every new discovery has the potential to rewrite our understanding. The absence of artifacts does not prove extinction in any region. It may simply reflect the limits of preservation. Yet the silence remains haunting, a reminder that our ancestors stood on a knife edge between survival and erasure. From a planetary vantage, this bottleneck is a brief episode in Earth's deep history, one cycle among many of glaciation and drought. Yet for humanity, it is the defining threshold, the moment when survival was most precarious. The great drought that nearly erased us left few direct traces, but the genetic imprint of its bottleneck endures in every living person. Our reduced diversity is a living memory of that time, carried invisibly in DNA. A scale reference reinforces this. While Homo sapiens today number in the billions during the bottleneck, we may have been fewer than the number of passengers on a handful of modern aircraft. Such fragility underscores the contingency of survival. The silence in the fossil and archaeological record reflects not just the scarcity of evidence, but the scarcity of people. Yet against this silence stand the fires of caves, the beads of shells, the marks of ochre. These fragments remind us that continuity survived the shadow of extinction. Humanity endured by finding ecological refuges, by maintaining culture, and by sustaining the fragile links of exchange whenever corridors opened. The shadow of extinction passed closely, but it did not close fully. The Great Drought left the species reduced, silent in many regions, yet unbroken. From these remnants, the later expansion of humanity would unfold once climates shifted again. The silence of this period is both warning and testament, warning of how close extinction came, testament to how survival persisted even in near absence. After many millennia of drought and contraction, the planetary machinery that governs climate begins to turn again. Orbital shifts alter the distribution of sunlight, monsoon systems strengthen, and rainfall returns across parts of Africa. Slowly, the landscapes that had been stripped to dust begin to recover. Grasslands spread outward from rivers, wetlands refill, and lakes rise where for generations only salt flats shimmered. Lake Victoria, which had nearly disappeared, fills again, restoring an inland sea that attracts fishbirds and grazing herds. In the Sahara, evidence of regreening emerges in the form of pollen grains from grasses and trees preserved in cores from the Atlantic, showing that monsoons once more reached northward, transforming desert into savanna. This return of rain does not occur all at once, but in pulses, with wetter centuries alternating with drier ones. Yet the overall trend is toward renewal, and the ecosystems that had contracted into fragments expand again into wide corridors. For the humans who endured the bottleneck in caves, rivers, and coasts, these returning rains represent a profound shift in opportunity. The factual marker of this transformation lies in the archaeological record. Regions that were silent for tens of millennia suddenly show renewed traces of human presence. Stone tools reappear along river valleys and lake margins, indicating that people moved outward from refugees to occupy the spaces that had become habitable once more. A lesser-known detail comes from engravings and ornaments dated to this phase. At sites such as Blombos and elsewhere, symbolic artifacts increase in frequency, suggesting that cultural traditions not only persisted, but expanded as populations recovered. The return of ecological abundance seems to have coincided with a flourishing of symbolic life, perhaps as groups reconnected after long isolation. The unresolved mystery is how rapid this recovery was in demographic terms. Did populations expand swiftly, filling new landscapes within a few generations, or did growth occur gradually across thousands of years? Genetic evidence suggests both bottleneck and rebound, but the exact tempo remains uncertain. Archaeology provides snapshots rather than continuous narratives, leaving the details of recovery largely in shadow. What is clear is that renewed rainfall transformed survival from a fragile calculation into an expanding horizon. From a planetary perspective, the return of rain was inevitable. Earth's precession cycle shifted, strengthening summer insolation in the northern hemisphere, which intensified African monsoons and drew rainfall northward. The Sahara, which had been an impassable barrier, turned green again, dotted with lakes and rivers that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean and beyond. These shifts were part of recurring cycles that have alternated between green and arid Sahara phases many times in the past 3 million years. Humanity's survival through one of the driest phases positioned it to take advantage of the next wet one. The scale of transformation is vast. The Sahara alone covers over 9 million square kilometers. To see it shift from barren desert to a patchwork of savanna and wetland is to witness one of Earth's most dramatic ecological reversals. On a smaller scale, valleys that had been empty for millennia now host grazing animals, herds of antelope, elephants, and even hippos in newly filled lakes. For humans, this meant not only food, but pathways. Corridors that had been closed opened again, allowing groups to move, interact, and exchange. The return of rain thus restored not only ecosystems, but networks of connection. Archaeological sites record these shifts in subtle ways. Microscopic analysis of sediments shows increasing charcoal evidence of more frequent fire use as populations expanded into new territories. Stone tool assemblages diversify, reflecting both population growth and renewed interaction between groups. Shell beads and ochre artifacts continue showing that symbolic traditions carried through the bottleneck were now part of a broader cultural repertoire. These markers suggest that recovery was not merely biological, but cultural, a resurgence of both population and meaning. Yet mysteries persist. Why did symbolic traditions intensify during this recovery? Was it the product of renewed social contact, larger group sizes, or cultural competition as populations expanded into new areas? Archaeologists debate whether the increase in symbolic artifacts reflects innovation or simply preservation bias, but the impression remains of a cultural flowering alongside demographic recovery. From the planetary vantage, this phase represents the resilience of life within Earth's cycles. Just as deserts advance during one interval, they retreat in the next. For humanity, the challenge was to persist through the low points long enough to take advantage of the high points. The Great Drought tested this resilience more than any previous episode, but the return of rain demonstrates that survival brought reward in the form of renewed abundance. A scale comparison highlights the change where once humanity may have been reduced to a few thousand individuals. Now populations expanded across corridors longer than the span of Europe, reclaiming spaces that had been uninhabitable for tens of millennia. This expansion set the stage for later dispersals out of Africa, which would occur when similar climatic windows opened beyond the continent. The return of rain also carried risks. As populations grew and groups reoccupied old lands, competition for resources may have increased. Yet the archaeological record suggests that cultural continuity and exchange smoothed these encounters. Shared symbolic practices may have acted as social glue, reinforcing cooperation and alliances. Fire use remained central, and hearths multiplied as camps spread into newly green landscapes. The sound of rivers returned where silence had dominated, and with them came the expansion of human presence across a recovering continent. From the planetary perspective, the recovery is temporary, for the cycles of aridity and humidity would continue. Yet for the humans who endured, the return of rain was transformative. It turned survival from a narrow calculation into an expansive possibility. It allowed the species to grow, diversify, and eventually to prepare for the journeys that would carry it across continents. The Great Drought had nearly erased humanity, but the return of rain ensured that its survival was not only preserved, but multiplied. The silence of deserts gave way to the sound of water, and with it, humanity stepped outward once more into landscapes that for generations had been abandoned. With the return of rainfall and the recovery of grasslands, humanity begins to expand outward from the narrow refuges that had sustained survival during the bottleneck years. Populations that once clustered along coasts, caves, and remnant rivers now spread into valleys, savannas, and wetlands that had been uninhabitable for tens of millennia. Genetic evidence records this renewal in the form of greater diversity and broader distribution of lineages, a rebound from the contraction that had reduced effective population sizes to only a few thousand. Archaeology confirms the demographic recovery. Regions that were silent for millennia suddenly show new traces of occupation, stone tools, hearths, and food remains that signal people moving back into landscapes long abandoned. The fact of expansion is clear, though the pace remains debated. A lesser-known detail is found in the archaeological record of North Africa. As the Sahara turned green again, lakes and rivers reappeared, creating a vast corridor of habitable land. Rock art and occupation sites from later periods record the presence of animals, such as giraffes, elephants, and hippos, evidence that ecosystems once associated with sub-Saharan Africa flourished in the Sahara itself. Though much of this record dates to more recent humid phases, the cycles of regreening after long droughts demonstrate how dramatically the desert could transform into a mosaic of wetlands and savannas. For humans, these phases provided pathways of movement that were otherwise sealed by sand. The unresolved mystery is how quickly humans exploited these renewed corridors. Did expansion occur in just a few generations, filling the Sahara and beyond, or did it take millennia for scattered groups to reconnect? Genetic models allow for both rapid and gradual scenarios, but the precise time